My name is Lucia Vargas. I am 44 years old. On a Tuesday morning in April, I was sitting in my car outside a building on Navigation Boulevard in Houston, Texas. I was looking at a photograph on my phone. The photograph had been posted the night before by a food account with 82,000 followers. The caption said, "Obsessed with the new Raíces Dallas. Cannot stop thinking about the enfrigiladas." I know those enfrigiladas. I know them because I made them. I spent 14 months developing that dish. I tested the bean-to-chili ratio 41 times before I got it to where it needed to be. The black beans have to be cooked with a specific quantity of dried epazote added in the last 20 minutes, or the earthiness goes flat. The guajillo paste is made fresh every morning, not the day before, because the flavor changes overnight in a way most people would not notice, and I cannot stop noticing. The queso fresco has to be added at a specific temperature or it breaks down wrong. The crema is folded in at the last moment. Nobody knew any of that except me and my grandmother. And now, apparently, a restaurant in Dallas with my brother's name on the website and no mention of mine anywhere. I sat in the car for a long time. The building on Navigation Boulevard was Raíces, the original. The one I had opened 9 years ago with 40 seats and an open kitchen and a menu built entirely from my grandmother's foundations, rebuilt in my own hands over 11 years of notebooks and tests and failures, and the particular kind of patience that cooking requires. The one with my name on the health permit, my hands in every dish, my voice in every staff meeting for 9 consecutive years. I did not call Marco that morning. I did not text him. I did not call anyone. I looked at the photograph for a while. Then I opened my notes app and I started writing down what I knew and what I needed to find out. That is how I work. It always has been. My grandmother taught me that. Let me take you back to where it started. I grew up in the East End of Houston, 3rd generation. My great-grandparents came from Oaxaca in the 1940s and settled in the neighborhood that the rest of the city did not pay much attention to for a long time. The streets were close together, and the houses were small, and every yard had at least one plant that someone's grandmother had started from a cutting she had brought from somewhere else. My grandparents raised my father there. My father raised Marco and me there, in a house with a kitchen that faced the backyard, and a ceiling fan in the living room that clicked on every 3rd rotation. My father worked in logistics, which meant long hours and a phone that rang at inconvenient times, and a man who came home tired and ate quietly and loved his family in the practical way that tired people love their families, with consistency rather than demonstration. My mother worked in hospital administration. She was organized and precise and ran the house on a schedule the way she ran an office floor, with clear expectations and no tolerance for things left unfinished. Marco was 3 years older than me. He was good at numbers from the beginning, good at reading a room, good at understanding what people wanted before they said it. He was the kind of child who negotiated his curfew rather than arguing about it, and usually got what he asked for because he had already thought through the counterarguments. I was the kind of child who forgot what time it was when I was doing something interesting, and the most interesting thing I ever found was my grandmother's kitchen. Abuela Rosa lived 4 blocks from us. Her full name was Rosa Elena Vargas, and she had been in that house since 1962. She was a small woman who moved efficiently and spoke directly, and had never in her life understood the point of decorative pillows. She had worked in restaurant kitchens for 30 years, starting at 19 in a kitchen downtown that paid her poorly and gave her no credit for what she knew, and ending at 49 when her knees told her the standing was done. By the time I was old enough to remember her clearly, she was in her mid-60s, and she cooked only for the family. But she cooked the way people cook when food is a language they speak better than any other. Deliberately, with attention, with the kind of confidence that comes from having made a thing correctly 10,000 times. I started going to her house after school when I was 7 years old. My mother arranged it as childcare. What it became was the most important education of my life. Abuela Rosa did not hand me a recipe and tell me to follow it. She held a dried guajillo chili up to the kitchen light on the second afternoon I was there and asked me what I saw. I said a red chili. She said look at where the color changes near the stem. She said the darker it gets toward the stem, the more complex the heat. She said you cannot understand what something will taste like until you have looked at it carefully in good light. I was 7 years old. I did not fully understand what she was telling me, but I remembered it. I have thought about it several times a week for 37 years. She taught me how to toast dried chilies in a dry pan and what color meant done versus ruined, and that the difference between those two things was about 45 seconds and your full attention. She taught me how to grind in the malkajit, which is heavier and slower than a blender, and produces a paste with a texture that is completely different from what a blender produces, and that the difference matters in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who has not put both versions next to each other. She taught me that mole is not a recipe. It is a sequence of decisions, and every decision changes what the next one needs to be, and you cannot rush through the earlier ones to get to the later ones faster. She taught me to taste at every stage and to keep tasting even when I thought I was done. The kitchen smelled of dried chilies and epazote, and the soap Rosa used on her hands before she started anything, an orange soap in a block that she bought from a Mexican grocery 3 streets over. The clay pot with the chipped lid sat on the back burner almost always. She used it for beans, and for some of the longer braises, and for a sopa de lima that I have been chasing the exact flavor of for 22 years and have come close but not quite reached. She said the chip did not make the pot broken. She said a thing that has been used correctly gets marked by it, and that is not damage, that is record. I spent 10 years in that kitchen. From 7 to 17, every afternoon that school allowed, and every Sunday morning. When I was 8, I learned that the order in which you add ingredients to a braise is not a preference. It is a sequence that changes the chemistry of what you are making, and that most people do not understand this because they have only ever followed recipes rather than learned the reason behind them. When I was 10, I learned how to read a chili's age by its flexibility, how to tell whether the smoke from a toasted seed was doing what it was supposed to do or had gone a degree past useful. When I was 11, Rosa let me make the rice by myself for the first time. I got the ratio of water wrong, and the rice came out mushy, and she did not let me throw it away. She said, "Eat it and remember what wrong feels like." She said, "You cannot fix something next time if you do not understand completely what went wrong this time." That was the lesson underneath all the other lessons. Not just what to do, why it worked, not just the recipe, the reasoning behind the recipe. I have been cooking professionally for 20 years and I still come back to that. When I was 12, I made the enfrigiladas on my own, start to finish, without Rosa correcting me, and they were right. Not exactly like hers. Mine, which was what she had been building toward all along. When I was 14, she let me make the mole for a family dinner with 12 people at the table. There was a calmness in me that night that I did not have the name for at the time. I was standing at her stove managing 3 pots and watching the sauce and thinking about nothing except the mole. I understand now that was concentration the way concentration is supposed to feel, when everything outside the task falls quiet and the task itself is the whole room. My great-uncle said it was the best mole he had eaten outside of Oaxaca. Rosa said nothing. I later understood that her silence was the highest version of what she was capable of giving. When I was 17, I started writing things down. Not because she told me to, because I had begun to understand that what she was teaching me was not replicable from memory alone. There was too much of it. The combinations, the sequences, the specific adjustments for humidity and altitude, and the age of the ingredients. I bought a black composition notebook from the school supply section of a drugstore on Cesar Chavez, and I started writing it all down. Dates in the upper right corner of each entry, every modification noted. That was where the notebook started, not as a business strategy, not as legal protection, as a way of honoring something that deserved to be written down carefully. When I was 22, Rosa had a stroke. She recovered partially. Her speech came back mostly. Her mobility returned enough for a cane. Her hands were not what they had been. The fine motor work that cooking requires, the grinding, the shaping, the precision with heat, was no longer possible for her. So I cooked for her. Every Sunday afternoon, I came to her house on Telephone Road, and I made the things she had made for me. She sat at the table with her coffee, the one with the chip on the handle that matched the chip on the pot, and she watched and she corrected, and she was specific in her corrections in a way that told me she was still paying complete attention. She would say, "The episode went in too early," or "You are rushing the paste," or occasionally that one, "You got that one right." Coming from Rosa Vargas, that was the highest possible acknowledgement. She died when I was 29. A Saturday in February, which she would have found appropriate, and which I have chosen to find meaningful rather than random. The night before she died, I had been at her house. We had eaten together, and I had made the sopa de lima, and she had said nothing critical, which by that point in our relationship meant it was exactly right. I drove home at 9. She died at 4 in the morning. My father called at 4:37. I remember the specific color of the light in my apartment, the way it looked when I turned the lamp on and sat down on the floor, because sitting in a chair seemed like the wrong response to the information. The funeral was on a Thursday. The kitchen at her house was cleaned and reorganized by her daughters-in-law in the days that followed, and most of what was in the cabinets was distributed to the family. Before that distribution happened, my father found the note in the drawer beside the stove. It was addressed to him specifically, asking him to give 3 things to Lucia. The recipe cards, 17 of them, written in Rosa's handwriting in blue ink on index cards held together with a rubber band. The clay pot, and the note itself, which ended with the sentence I have already told you about. I have kept that note in my wallet since the afternoon of the funeral. It has been folded and unfolded so many times, the paper has gone soft at the creases and feels different from regular paper, thinner, the way important things get when they have been handled consistently for a long time. I keep it not as a reminder of her, because I do not need a reminder of someone who is in every dish I have ever made and every decision I have ever made in a kitchen. I keep it because it is the closest thing I have to operating instructions, and because she was specific enough to write it down and leave it where it could be found, and I have always believed that specificity is its own form of love. I was a line cook in Montrose when she died. I had been cooking professionally since I was 23, working my way through 3 kitchens that each taught me something the previous one had not. I was competent and fast, and my mise en place was always clean. But the food I was making was not my food. It was someone else's menu, someone else's idea of what a plate should say. I started cooking at home the way Rosa had cooked. Seriously. Experimentally. Using her recipe cards as starting points and moving outward from them into territory that was mine as well as hers. The first composition notebook after her death was the 4th one overall. I filled it in 7 months. By the time I reached notebook 6, I had a set of dishes that I believed were ready to be cooked for people outside my apartment. I had the enfrigiladas at the version I wanted them. I had a sopa de lima with a clarity of flavor I had been working toward for 3 years. I had the beginning of a black mole that was nowhere near finished but was on the right path. Marco came to dinner in the spring of 2014. I made him 4 dishes and watched him eat. Marco eats the way he does everything, efficiently and with his attention already moving to what comes next. That night, he slowed down. He put his fork down after the 3rd dish and sat with the food for a moment. Then he said, "This is something real." I said I knew. He said, "What do you want to do with it?" I told him I wanted a food truck. Small enough to manage alone, low enough overhead to absorb if it did not work. He said he could handle the licensing, the commissary arrangements, the vendor relationships, the scheduling, the accounting, all of the business infrastructure, if I handled everything that happened in the kitchen. I said yes. We shook hands at my kitchen table in a duplex on Harrisburg Boulevard at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. That was the partnership agreement. A handshake and a yes, and an understanding that was real, but was not written down. That was the gap he eventually walked into. I did not know it was a gap at the time. The truck ran for 2 years. We set up at farmers markets on Saturday mornings and food festivals, and a regular spot on Airline Drive on Friday evenings that built its own following over 12 months. I learned things on the truck that I could not have learned in a restaurant kitchen. How to cook for volume without losing precision. How to manage a menu that had to be portable and repeatable in a space the size of a hallway. How to talk to every single person who came to the window, because on a truck there is no dining room buffer, no server in between. It is just you and the person who is deciding whether to trust your food. The enfrigiladas were the thing people returned for. People drove from the Heights and from Sugar Land and from the Woodlands, which is 45 minutes north in good traffic, to stand in a line on a Friday evening and eat from a paper bowl in a parking lot. I watched them from the window. A woman ate the first bowl standing next to her car and then came back and ordered another before she left. A man told me through the window that the sopa de lima tasted like his grandmother's kitchen, and then stood very still for a moment in the way people stand when something has reached somewhere they did not expect. I watched all of it. That was when I understood fully what Rosa had meant. The food was telling the truth. I was just the person making sure it could be heard. By 2016, we were looking for a space. Marco found the building on Navigation Boulevard in the spring of that year. It needed everything. The kitchen was completely inadequate, the ventilation was wrong for what I needed, the floor had to be torn out and replaced. We negotiated the lease, Marco handled that, and then I redesigned the kitchen layout from scratch. Every station, every piece of equipment, the flow of the line during a rush, the position of the pass relative to the dining room. I drew it on a piece of graph paper at 2 in the morning, and Marco had a contractor walk it the next week. We put in $112,000 between us. split evenly. Marco raised his half through a small business loan from a community lender on Canal Street. I raised mine through 4 years of savings and a personal loan from a woman named Dolores Fuentes. I want to tell you about Dolores because she is part of this story. She was 63 when she first came to the food truck on a Friday evening on Airline Drive. She ate the enfrigiladas standing beside her car in the parking lot, the way people eat at a food truck when they cannot wait to find somewhere to sit. She came back the following week. She came back 9 times after that before she introduced herself through the window. She said her name, and she said she had run a small catering business for 20 years, and she knew the difference between food that was good and food that was true. And she said mine was the second kind. And she asked if there was anything she could do to help it reach more people. I called her when I needed the last $30,000 to make the Raíces build-out work. She did not hesitate. She said yes on the same call, asked for the loan terms in writing, and signed the paperwork within a week. She said, "I am not investing in a restaurant. I am investing in a person who knows what they are making and why." She ate at Raíces once a month from the day we opened. She always sat at the same table, the two-top near the window that got the last of the afternoon light. She always left a handwritten note with her bill, not a review, a sentence or two, about what the food made her think about, where it took her, what it told her. I kept every one of those notes in a drawer in the office on Navigation Boulevard. Dolores Fuentes was the person who believed in the food before the food had a building. I want you to know that her name belongs in this story the same way Rosa's name does. Not everyone who shapes a thing gets their name on the signage, but they belong in the telling. Raíces opened in October 2016. 40 seats. Open kitchen so the dining room could see the line at work during service. 14 items on the menu, every one of them built on Rosa's foundations and carried through my notebooks over 3 years of development and testing. The walls were the color of dried corn, and we had lit the space with pendant lights that hung low over the tables and gave everything a warmth that felt like late afternoon rather than restaurant bright. I had chosen the music, instrumental, nothing too recognizable, something that could sit under a conversation without pulling anyone out of it. The first night of service, I burned my left forearm on the edge of a sauté pan during the dinner rush and did not notice until we closed at 10:30 and the adrenaline came down. It was a burn about 2 inches long on the inside of my left forearm. I looked at it under the kitchen light and thought, that is a first night burn. That is a scar that is going to mean something for a while. Marco stood at the host stand the entire 5 hours of service, talking to every table, moving through the room with the kind of ease that he had always had in social spaces, running the front of the house with his phone in one hand and a calm that made the evening feel more organized than it was. We did 37 covers that first night. I stood in the walk-in cooler at 10:45 after the last ticket was done and the kitchen was being cleaned, and I let myself feel what the night had been. I did not cry from sadness. I cried from something closer to completion. The clay pot was on the shelf above the prep station. I had put it there the morning we opened. I could see it from where I was standing in the walk-in through the small window in the door. A chipped clay pot in a professional kitchen on Navigation Boulevard. That is what it looked like to get something right. In the 9 years that followed, we built something that mattered in the way that restaurants can matter to a neighborhood when a restaurant is doing what it is actually supposed to do. The Houston Press named us one of the 10 essential Houston restaurants in 2019. A food critic from a national magazine came through in 2020 and spent 2 evenings eating through the menu and wrote a piece that described the cooking as deeply rooted and quietly revolutionary. I have that print copy in a frame in the office at Raíces, not because I need the external validation, because the critic used the word rooted and Rosa would have agreed with that word. But the critics are not what tell you what a place actually is. What tells you is who comes back and why. There was a group of women, 6 of them, who found us at the food truck in 2015 and followed us to Navigation Boulevard when we opened. They came the 3rd Saturday of every month. Always the same table, the corner one near the window. Always the same order, which the kitchen eventually had ready when they sat down because there was no point in making them say it again. They stayed until we started stacking chairs at 10:30, and they tipped generously, and one of them, a woman named Gloria, told me once that the monthly dinner was the one thing in her calendar she had never canceled in 4 years for any reason. I asked why. She said, "Because this is the place where I feel like myself." I thought about Rosa when she said that. There was a man named Biteau who came in alone every Tuesday for 6 years. He always sat at the end of the counter nearest the pass, where he could see into the kitchen. He always ordered the black mole. He was quiet and polite and never lingered past what was comfortable. In 2021, he came in on a Wednesday instead of a Tuesday. I noticed because after 6 years you notice. He sat down and said, "I just wanted to make sure you were still here." I said we were. He ordered the mole. He ate it slowly the way he always did. He left a $20 tip on a $12 dish, the way he always did, and went home. Those people are the thing a restaurant is built for. Not the reviews, not the covers. The people who come back because the food is telling them something true about where they come from, and they need to hear it said out loud on a regular basis. Marco talked about expansion beginning in 2020. Marco talked about expansion beginning in 2020. A second location, a franchise model, a way to take the concept and let it grow beyond what we could manage directly. I was cautious. I said the food was the thing, and the food required me, and I could not be in 2 kitchens at the same time. He said we would find operators who could be trained properly. He said the menu documentation would be the guide. I said I needed to be part of every decision about the kitchen and the menu and the training process if we moved forward. He said, of course. Both times we had this conversation, in 2020 and again in 2021, he said, "Of course, Lucia. That goes without saying." It does not go without saying. I understand that now. Nothing of consequence goes without saying. Everything that matters has to be said explicitly and then written down explicitly and then signed by everyone whose name belongs on it. The thing that seems too obvious to put in writing is always the exact thing that someone will later claim was never agreed to. Say it out loud. Write it down. Sign it. Do not skip any of those 3 steps because the relationship feels solid enough to skip them. The relationship is not the protection. The document is the protection. The relationship is what makes you want to skip the document. That is the trap. In April of this year, I saw the photograph. A Tuesday morning, 8:17, in my car on Navigation Boulevard, looking at a bowl of my enfrigiladas in a dining room I had never been in, with my brother's name listed as founder on a website I had never seen. 16 months of a parallel world I had not known existed. I went inside and opened the restaurant. I ran the lunch service. I made 312 enfrigiladas that day, the same dish I had seen in that photograph, the same dish that was currently being served in Dallas under a name I had built and a founder credit that did not include me. I made every one of them with the same attention I brought to every service. That is how I work. The work does not get less because something is wrong outside it. If anything, it gets more precise. The kitchen was where I could think clearly. I did not say anything to anyone on the line. I needed to understand exactly what I was looking at before I said a word to anyone. That evening, I went home and I searched everything I could find. The Raíces Dallas website had photographs of the dining room, photographs of the food, a brief founding story that described the restaurant as a celebration of Mexican culinary tradition rooted in the flavors of Houston. Marco's name was in the About section as founder. There was no mention of any other founding member, any chef, any family. There was a photograph of my enfrigiladas on the homepage. I recognized it not from the dish, but from the specific angle, which was the angle I had been photographing my dishes from for years, slightly above and to the left, the way I had started doing it, because the light in the Raíces kitchen hit from that direction. The Texas Secretary of State filing for Raíces Dallas LLC listed a sole member, Marco Alejandro Vargas, his home address, his phone number, filed December of 2 years prior. The Raíces Austin LLC was filed 6 months after Dallas, same structure, same sole member. I found a trade publication interview from 14 months ago in which Marco was quoted discussing the franchise model he had developed for his Houston restaurant concept. The article described him as the founder and creative force behind one of Houston's most beloved neighborhood restaurants. I read that sentence twice. Then I read it a third time. The menu in Dallas and the menu in Austin were my menus, the enfrigiladas, the sopa de lima, the black mole, the 4 seasonal dishes I rotated through the year. The pricing structure was identical to what I used at Raíces. The plating descriptions in the online reviews matched mine exactly because they were mine. My food. My grandmother's foundations. My 11 notebooks. No mention of me anywhere I looked. Not on the websites, not in the interview, not in the franchise filings publicly available on the state site. My name appeared nowhere. My work appeared everywhere. I called Patricia Walsh the next morning at 8 o'clock. Patricia is an intellectual property attorney I had met at a small business event 2 years earlier. She was the only person in the room that evening who said exactly what she thought without performing warmth about it, and I had kept her card because that quality is rarer than it should be. I told her I had something she needed to see. She said come in that afternoon. I brought all 11 notebooks. Patricia read the enfrigiladas section of Notebook 3 with the dates visible, and the 14 months of modifications documented across 6 pages and the first 2 pages of Notebook 4. She turned each page slowly. She was quiet in the way of someone who is constructing something in their mind while they read. She looked at the photograph metadata from my phone archive, 314 food photographs, everyone geotagged at my apartment on Harrisburg Boulevard or at the Raíces kitchen, the earliest ones predating the restaurant opening by 2 years and the food truck by 8 months. She read the entity filings for Raíces Dallas and Raíces Austin. She reviewed the franchise onboarding materials that Marco had filed publicly with the Texas Secretary of State as part of the franchise registration, which contained kitchen training documents I had written on my own laptop over 2 weeks in 2018, plating guides I had formatted and printed for the Raíces kitchen, preparation specifications written in my vocabulary, my sentence structures, my level of specificity. None of it attributed to me. None of it referenced as originating from anywhere. Just incorporated, unchanged, into a franchise packet filed under Marco Alejandro Vargas, sole member. Patricia put the last page down on her desk. She aligned it with the edge of the desk the way she aligns everything precisely because she is that kind of person. Then she looked at me and said 3 things. She said, "Whoever filed these franchise agreements made a significant miscalculation." She said, "They licensed intellectual property they do not own." She said, "The documentation you have brought me today is cleaner than most IP cases I see in a calendar year." Then she asked me what I wanted. I told her. She said, "Understood, let's file." I drove back to Raíces afterward. I ran the dinner service. I made the black mole the way I have been making it since Notebook 6, and I watched it come out of the kitchen and go to the tables, and I thought, this is mine. It has always been mine. We are just going to make the paper say what the food has been saying for 11 years. I told my parents in May, 3 weeks after I had found the photograph and understood what I was looking at. I sat at their kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, and I showed them the entity filings and the websites and the interview. I showed them the menu from the Dallas location with my dishes listed and Marco's name at the top. My mother sat at the kitchen table and looked at the pages for a long time without speaking. My father said there must be an explanation. I said the explanation was in the documents and it was not ambiguous. My mother said to talk to Marco first before anything else happened. I said Patricia had already contacted his attorney earlier that week. My mother said my name quietly, the specific way she says it when she is scared and does not want to say that she is scared. I put my hand over hers on the table. I said, "Mama, I know what I am doing. I have the notebooks. I have the photographs. I have Patricia. I am going to be fine. The food belongs to me. That part has always been true. We are just going to make the paper say it now." Marco called me after the attorneys had spoken. I let it go to voicemail the first time. He called again an hour later, and I answered. He talked for 4 minutes. He said there had been a misunderstanding about the entity structure. He said the timing of the filings had been a business decision and that he had always intended to formalize my role in the franchise going forward. He said things had moved faster than expected with the Dallas and Austin investors, and that he had been meaning to talk to me about it. I listened to all of it. He spoke carefully, in the measured way he had always spoken when he was trying to manage a situation, and I heard in his voice something I recognized as the sound of a person who had done something and knew it, and was trying to find the version of events that made it smaller than it was. When he finished, I said one sentence. I said, "I have Notebook 3 open right now, the Enfrigiladas. First entry, March 11, 2013. Do you want to tell me whose handwriting this is?" He was quiet for a while, long enough that I thought he might have hung up. Then he said he was sorry. I said I believed him. I also said sorry did not change the documentation, and I was moving forward with Patricia regardless. He said, "Lucia, this doesn't have to be a legal thing." I said, "It already is a legal thing. You made it a legal thing when you filed in December 2 years ago." He said my name the way our mother says it when she is scared. I said, "Marco, I love you. I am going to do this correctly." His wife, Elena, called twice. I did not take those calls, not from cruelty and not from anger. I had nothing to gain from that conversation, and the legal process required my complete attention. Elena is not a bad person. She is a person married to someone who made a significant mistake and who was trying to minimize the damage to her family. I understood that impulse completely. It was just not a conversation that could help anything. My parents held a Sunday lunch in June with all of us present. Tamales and rice and horchata and the cake from the bakery on Canal Street, which my mother buys when she wants a room to soften. Marco made a proposal at that lunch. He offered me a 50% stake in the Dallas and Austin entities going forward. I said no. He said he thought that was fair. I said fair was not the standard I was using. The standard I was using was accuracy. What was accurate was that the recipes were mine, and the franchise had been built on them without my knowledge or my name. Accurate meant my name as originating chef and intellectual property holder on all documentation, legally binding, or the race's name off every location I did not control. He said he did not think that was reasonable. I said our attorneys would determine what was documented, and documentation had always been my particular strength. Patricia filed in July. The franchise agreements were challenged on the basis that the intellectual property being licensed, specifically the recipes, the menu design, the plating specifications, the kitchen training documents, all developed by me and incorporated into the franchise materials without attribution or compensation, belonged to me and had never been legally transferred. The Dallas and Austin franchise operators were separate investment groups who had purchased their agreements in good faith. Once their attorneys saw the IP documentation, they moved quickly. They did not want to be parties to a contested ownership claim with a paper trail as complete as mine. Both operators settled independently of Marco. The franchise agreements were voided in October. Both locations were given 6 months to negotiate a direct licensing arrangement with me or rebrand. Neither contacted me to negotiate. The Dallas location closed in March of the following year. The Austin location closed 2 months after that. I know this because people sent me the articles and because it happened the way things happen when the thing a place was built on is removed. Quietly. No statement. The food just stopped being there. I had opened Vargas' Kitchen in November, the month after the franchise agreements were voided. A space in the Heights, 28 seats, a kitchen with the best ventilation system I have ever cooked under. The landlord had renovated recently, and the space was clean and the bones were right. I designed the kitchen layout the same way I had designed the Raíces kitchen, from the line outward, starting with how the food moves and building the rest around that. I named the restaurant after the family. Not after the restaurant concept, not after the brand, not after anything a franchise could attach to. After the Vargas family. After Rosa. After my father, who ate quietly and loved his family in practical ways. After my great-grandparents who came from Oaxaca and settled in a neighborhood the rest of the city did not pay attention to and grew things in their yard and built something that lasted. The clay pot with the chipped lid sits on the shelf above my prep station at Vargas' Kitchen. I moved it from Navigation Boulevard the week I opened. I can see it from anywhere in the kitchen. On the first night of service, it was there while I made the enfrigiladas and the sopa de lima and the black mole and 4 new dishes I had been developing during the 8 months the legal process ran its course. I tested those 4 new dishes the way I always test. Small batches, dated notes in Notebook 12, failed versions documented as carefully as successful ones, every modification written down with the reason. The food writer who reviewed us in February described the black mole as the finest she had tasted in Houston and possibly in the state. I sent the review to Patricia by text at 7 in the morning when I read it. She sent back one word: obviously. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with the clay pot visible on the shelf through the kitchen doorway, and thought about Rosa and the guajillo chili held up to the light, and the 41 months of Notebook 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 that led to a black mole a food writer was going to call the finest in the state. I sat with that for a while, long enough that the coffee went cold. Races on Navigation Boulevard is still mine, still open. The kitchen I designed, the menu I built, the 40 seats, the open kitchen, the pendant lights that make the room feel like late afternoon, all of it continuing. Marco is no longer part of the operational structure. The legal separation of our business interests is documented and final, in a way it should have been documented from the beginning of the food truck, in a way I know now to never let be undocumented again. The building I have run for 9 years has my name on the health permit, and on the operating agreement, and on the signage above the door the way it should have been all along. I do not see Marco at family events right now. That may change eventually. My parents are managing a situation that has no comfortable shape, and I have a great deal of love for them for trying as hard as they try. My mother calls me every Sunday. She asks about the restaurants, both of them, and she asks about Dolers, who still eats at Races once a month and still leaves a note with her bill that says something about the food that I keep in a drawer in the office. My mother is trying to hold something together, and I love her for trying. I also do not need the shape to go back to what it was. The shape is different now. The shape that is accurate looks like 2 restaurants with my name on them, and a brother I do not have dinner with, and parents who call every Sunday, and a clay pot on a shelf in the Heights that has been in my family since before I was born. That is the accurate shape. I am learning to be at home in it. I have thought about what Marco was afraid of. I have had enough time with the question to have an honest answer. He was afraid that the food was the thing. That Races was only Races because of what came out of my kitchen, and that made him permanently the second most important person in the room we had built together, regardless of how many vendor contracts he had negotiated or how smoothly he had run the front of house for 9 years. He could not close that distance. Not honestly. So he tried to own the room by removing the person who made the room worth being in. What he did not account for was 11 notebooks in my own handwriting, and a grandmother who once told me that a chip in something does not make it broken, and a woman named Dolores Fuentes who had eaten at the food truck 11 times and given me a private loan because she knew the difference between food that was good and food that was true. And a food photographer in Houston with 82,000 followers who posted a photograph of my enfrigiladas in a Dallas restaurant and tagged the original Races, and in doing so handed me the evidence on a Tuesday morning in April. I want to share a few things that have stayed with me through all of this. Document what you build before anyone asks you to. My notebooks were not a legal strategy. They were how I worked. I started them at 17 because my grandmother was teaching me things that deserved to be written down carefully, and my memory alone was not sufficient for the level of precision the work required. I wrote in those notebooks through 2 years of a food truck and 9 years of a restaurant because that is how I think through food. When Patricia laid them on her desk and turned the pages, she was not reading a file I had assembled for a dispute. She was reading 11 years of my ordinary working method. The documentation that settled the case in my favor was built 1 entry at a time on Tuesday afternoons when nothing was wrong. You do not document because you expect a problem. You document because precision is a form of respect for the work itself. And what you have built with that precision is significantly harder for someone else to claim. Your name belongs on the thing you made, not as vanity, as record. When Marco and I started the food truck, I did not ask for my name on the entity filings. I was focused on the kitchen. I trusted the partnership completely, and I thought the trust was the same as the document. It was not. A handshake between people who love each other is real. It is also not legally binding in the way that a document with your name on it is legally binding. I am not saying do not trust the people you build things with. I am saying the trust and the document are two separate protections, and you need both. Get your name on the paper while the relationship is warm and uncomplicated, and the asking feels unnecessary. It is much harder to get there later, and the asking, when it comes later, will not feel unnecessary at all. The person who tried to erase you had to use your work to do it. That is not a small detail. Marco could not attract franchise investors without the reputation that 9 years of my cooking had built. He could not sell the concept without my menu. He could not train the operators in Dallas and Austin without the kitchen documents I had written and the plating guides I had formatted. Everything he constructed without my name still ran entirely on what I had made. He needed my work in order to cut me out of my work. That is evidence, not coincidence. When someone takes something from you, look carefully at what they chose to take. It tells you exactly what the thing was worth, and it tells you exactly where the documentation of ownership lies. When the people who love you ask you to make peace quickly, hear what they are actually asking for. My mother wanted a resolution that looked like Sunday lunch. That is a loving impulse, and I understand it completely. She had built a family, and the family had a shape, and the shape had a Sunday lunch in the middle of it, and she wanted the shape to stay. That is not the same thing as wanting the record to be accurate. She was trying to preserve something. I was trying to correct something. Those are different projects, and for a while they felt like they were in conflict. They do not have to be, but it takes time and honesty to align them. What I want to say to anyone whose family is asking you to make peace quickly is this: you can love the people asking and still understand that peace built on an inaccurate record is not peace. It is a postponed argument. And the longer it is postponed, the more it costs when it finally happens. The work is the argument. I did not explain at length to anyone what the black mole had cost me in time and focus and 41 months of documented development. I did not need to. The notebook said it. The photograph metadata said it. The dish itself, eaten by anyone who had been eating it for 9 years in Houston and then encountered it in Dallas in a restaurant with a different name on the owner line, said it. When your work is documented and real, you do not have to perform certainty about it. You do not have to be louder or more convincing or more insistent. You hand the notebook to the right person. You let them read. The work makes the case. It has been making it all along. You just have to make sure it is written down somewhere. My grandmother left me 3 items and a sentence. The recipe cards, the clay pot, and the food tells the truth about where you come from. Do not let it tell a lie. I want to tell you what I think she meant by that. She was not talking only about food. She was talking about the work. Whatever your work is, the thing you make or build or grow or teach or heal or design. The work carries information about where it came from. It carries the handwriting. It carries the decisions. It carries the specific accumulated knowledge of the person who made it and all the people who taught that person. You cannot remove that. You can try to put someone else's name on it. You can file it under a different LLC and photograph it in a different city. But the work still carries what it carries. The food still tells what it tells. And eventually, if the documentation exists and the right person reads it, the record corrects itself. The franchise told a lie. 2 cities found that out eventually. The record corrected itself, the way records do when the documentation is clean and the person who built the thing was patient enough to write it down and then patient enough to hand it to the right person and wait. My name is on my kitchens now, both of them, not borrowed, not arranged, not waiting to be formalized, mine. Dolores Fuentes still comes to races on Navigation Boulevard once a month. She still sits at the two-top near the window. She still leaves a note. Last month, the note said, "This is what it is supposed to taste like." I put it in the drawer with the others. I will keep it there as long as I keep the restaurant. I have a question for you before you go. My grandmother taught me the most important things I know, not in a classroom, in her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon with a dried guajillo chili held up to the light, asking me what I saw. She was the foundation. Everything I have ever built started in that kitchen on Telephone Road. I want to know who your foundation was. Drop a comment and tell me, who taught you the most important thing you know? It does not have to be about food. It can be anything at all. A person, a place, a single sentence said once that you have carried ever since. I will read every single comment. I always have and I always will.